Thank you, Julie. Morning, Mike and Don. Good to have you. Well, as you can see, I'm standing up here, and for the summer, I'll be up here teaching. Julie's class has ended. Now, Greg is going to take the rest of the summer, and today he had to work anyway, so then next week we have Marstellers. Pastor and Shirley will be here next Sunday. Looking forward to having them. Pastor is going to teach the Sunday school lesson and also have the morning preaching service. And then after that, it'll be I'll be teaching as long as we don't have a missionary or something until whenever the school year era starts, September-ish type thing. I think it's usually after missions conference is when we start our classes back up after the missions conference. So that's coming up pretty soon now. So we gotta get ready for that now. Anyway, pray for that as well. As once again, as far as I know, none of our missionaries are going to be home. I always like to have one of our missionaries for our missions conference, and we haven't been able to do that in the last year or two, and it looks like this year we won't either. So pray that God will lead the right missionaries to us, that we might have a great missions conference this year. But anyway, what I want to do today, as we look into the Word, I want to do a study over I don't know that I'll actually make it all summer with this. I might make it halfway through and then have to start something else. But I've been wanting to do a study on this topic for a while, and so I'm going to start it, see how far we get. We might only have 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, and then we'll have to change gears. That'll be okay. What I want to do is look at the topic, which is, if I can get that to come up here, the nations. God's dealing with the nations. That's really the bottom line. God's design for people, and that's when we think about nations, and I think often about the judgment of the nations and all of the things that the Bible says about the nations, and I think, what does that exactly mean? How is the judgment of the nations different than the judgment of the individuals for sin and those kinds of things? And so we're going to delve into that kind of thing, but we're going to go ahead and look at today the fact that it is God's design for people, and we're going to go ahead and define a few terms for ourselves here. The first one, I have a nice picture of a big city. That's supposed to be New York City up there, and at least part of it. That's not the whole thing. But as we think about the word nation or nations, there are 2 primary words in the Bible which are translated using the word nation or nations. And when I say 2 primary words, I'm speaking about one of them being a Hebrew word, and the other one being, of course, a Greek word equivalent. And so there's 2 words, 2 main words in the Bible. When you see the word nations, this is the word that is being used. One of these 2 words, anyway. First, we'll look at the Hebrew, goyi or goyim. It is translated by the word nation 374 times. The word heathen 143 times. So you get the idea there. When we're talking about nation or nations, 374. Heathen 143 times. Gentiles 30 times. People 11 times, for a total of 558 times in the Old Testament. That's quite a few times for a word to be mentioned like that. Obviously, the nations play a big relatively large role in God's plan. And we see that right from the beginning. We're going to be seeing that today. Right from the beginning, God begins to establish these nations. Of course, when Adam and Eve were the only two there, it was kind of difficult to form a nation. There you just had a couple, the beginnings of a family, and so couldn't have nations till a little bit later down the road. But eventually, of course, that was God's plan to do that. Now let's look at the Greek equivalent, which is ethnos, which of course we get our term ethnic groups from this kind of a term. There in the New Testament, it is translated Gentile, Gentiles, 93 times, because in the context there, the nations are being contrasted with the nation of Israel. All right, there's God's chosen nation, God's chosen people, the Israelites in the Old Testament, and then of course there are the nations, the other nations, that are many nations. All right, and so many times when that in the context is being talked about, the King James translators translated Gentiles. But nation 30 times, nations 37, pagans 1, and again people 2, for a total of 163 times in the New Testament. So obviously very similar in meaning, the two terms, the one in Hebrew, the one in Greek. And so we're going to go ahead and get started having that knowledge. I want to go ahead and look at, well, take your Bibles, if you will, to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. We have an early general history which took place after the flood. All right, so 10, chapter 10 of Genesis actually is kind of a summation, if you will, a summary of what happens after the flood and how the nations are formed. All right, so I'm going to read chapter 10, and basically chapter 10 is the chapter that made me quit reading the Bible as a young person every time I tried, just about. As a young teenager, I determined I was going to read the Bible several times. And when I got to chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, I several times quit. All right, so that's just one of those kind of chapters with a lot of names in it and a lot of things going on that I didn't understand. But I see the need for it now, and so we're going to go ahead and look through some of this. I don't know that we need to read every single name in here to get the idea of what's going on. But chapter 10, verse 1. It says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah." And of course, Noah had these three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were born sons after the flood. Okay, so we've had an earth that has been somewhat populated. And now we have an earth that is somewhat, again, unpopulated, right? We're back to one family again. I mean, we have a little bit of a head start over Adam and Eve because Noah has his three sons and their wives with them. So they've got a little bit of a head start, but still very, very, very small population of the earth. All right, and so he goes through, if you go through the chapter, he goes through each of these sons and the sons that they had. He starts out with Japheth here in verse number 2, and then if you go on through here, you'll find out each one of the sons of Noah has a genealogy that is mentioned in chapter number 10. I want us to focus here on in verse number 5, it says, he goes through a bunch of names here, and then he says, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Okay? By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided. All right? Now, he's summarizing that the fact that now the nations were divided by, obviously, people groups went to different places, right? They went to different areas, all right? And generally speaking, what happened was those who spoke the same language went together to the same area. And those who spoke a different language, they went together to another area, all right? And so you have the forming of, the very early formation of nations taking place right back here in the book of Genesis. Now, let's go, again, he's going to go ahead and go through all of these names and all of these genealogies of these sons of Noah. You get down to verse 32, which is the last verse here. He says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Okay, so that's the general summary as he shared after the flood what began to happen. And he even goes out and talks about the division of tongues, and then, of course, people going out to the various places, different areas, not all together, but they go out to different areas, and of course that's what we know today. Now, a nation of people, sometimes we think of a nation of people as a plot of ground. In other words, the Polish people, where are they? They're in the plot of ground called Poland, generally speaking. Although we have several of them, many of them running around in the United States as well. My grandmother was full-born. She was born in the United States, but many of her brothers and sisters were born in Poland. She was 100% Polish, and she spoke Polish. She could speak it, and she cooked Polish, and we got used to some of that kind of food. And some of it I liked, and some of it I did not like at all. She used to make every one of the holidays. What was it? Christmas, or I can't remember if it was Christmas or New Year's. Anyway, she made grumpkies. Just the smell of those things made me sick. But there's stuffed cabbage. Stuffed cabbage. And I couldn't even stand the smell of them. I couldn't even get near them. I didn't want anything to do with them. But then she also made naleśnikis. Depending on what you put in a naleśniki, I could eat it. I could love it. A little crepe and rolled up stuff in it. She'd make those. Of course, she had pierogies. And she always made, there were certain kinds of those I liked, certain kinds I didn't. I always requested mine to be cooked without onions, because most of the time she would load them up. She would put onions and load them up in there, and I did not care for that too much. In fact, I hate onions. But most of them were cooked with onions in them, and mine weren't, and so they were good. I liked them, But we think many times we associate peoples with their various plot of grounds. And of course, it has so much more to do than just, that is where they went. The nations are not really the plot of grounds as much as they are the people that live there. And of course, the people tend to get connected to the plot of ground where they live. I mean, all you have to do is look at the situation in the Middle East, and there's all kinds of fighting over little plots of ground and over who owns it and who doesn't, and so we tend to get connected to the plot of ground where we live, don't we? We're very connected to this earth. What's going to happen to this earth someday? Somebody. Jim's waving. It's going to go bye-bye, isn't it? We were yesterday. We dropped my nephew off in Flint on Miller Road, and we went and had a bite to eat, and then everyone decided they wanted a milkshake before we left, so we went over to Sonic over there, right off the highway. And when we looked up, somebody looked up. It had just been raining a little bit. It didn't rain a whole lot, but it rained a little bit. And they looked up and they saw this rainbow, this double rainbow. I mean, it was one of the most magnificent sights you'd ever see. It was a whole rainbow. I mean, it was completely a circle, and then there was a complete another circle around it. I mean, it was unbelievable. Just a beautiful, beautiful sight to see that rainbow that was made there. But I'm trying to remember why exactly I brought that up, but there was a reason. What?
You're talking about not destroying the earth.
Oh yeah, not destroying the earth by rainbow. Yeah, that's why it was a rainbow. You remember why God sent the rainbow after the flood? What was the promise that rainbow symbolized? And by the way, it was not the symbol of the rainbow is not, back in God's promise, have anything to do with what mankind has twisted it into. All right? What did it mean? What? Okay. God would not again never again destroy the earth. And as was pointed out then as well, the promise was not that he would never destroy the earth. The promise was that he would never destroy it with a flood. Okay? And so the flood came, the rainbow, the promise of God. But what's going to happen to this earth one day? How's it going to be destroyed? The Bible tells us. What? Melt with fervent heat. Fire. All right? That's the real global warming right there. It is coming. There's no doubt about it. It is coming. We were talking about some of that in our vacation Bible school, and some of the blue stars, and even the secular literature, they admit that some of these hottest blue stars only have enough fuel in them. They burn so fast to burn from between 10,000 to 100,000 years. And as we pointed out, that's a real problem for the evolutionists, except that the evolutionists try to get a way around that. And their way around it is, because if this earth is billions and billions and billions of years old, how many blue stars should there be up in the heavens left? How many should there be? Shouldn't be any, right? A blue star, at best, some of them might last millions of years, but none of them have enough fuel to last billions of years. All right? Now, of course, they get around that by trying to suggest that somehow new stars are being formed all the time. And yet no one has ever seen a star being formed. That's their theory. And they have to have that as a theory, otherwise their whole theory goes up in smoke, because there shouldn't be any blue stars left. All right, so the blue stars are here, right? So God is the one who created everything, put it all together, and so God is the one who made everything, and God is the one who is at the end. We know that even our sun, is it going to burn forever? Is it possible that the sun could burn forever, physically? So what does that mean about this earth? What does it mean? Even scientifically, what does it mean? This earth has a limited time, doesn't it? It's not going to last forever. It's just not going to be here for long. It has a very limited time. And so you can talk about global warming, be concerned about all this stuff. Well, the fact of the matter is, God has already set a time. And everything on this earth that we hold so dear, we we become attached to this plot of ground. We become attached to our church and our church building. And by the way, God has given us a wonderful facility for which we praise Him. And of course, we know that godly men and women, many of them connected to us and to our families, put a lot of sweat and a lot of effort, a lot of giving into this place. And we very much appreciate it. But at the same time, we are very much aware that as wonderful as it is, as wonderful as our homes are and all of that, wonderful as Hope, Michigan is, we are very much aware that this is not going to be around forever. It's going to one day be done away. It's going to be melted with fervent heat. All right? And so that is true of all of these nations. Of course, they're connected to their plots of ground, but what's really important about them is, the most important thing about them is not the plot of ground they're on, but it is the people that make up those nations. And a nation is a nation because of people. All right? It's not the ground, it's the people. All right? And so we're supposed to go into all the world and preach the gospel to who? Every creature. How about if they're offended and if they think we're spreading American culture to them? Should we go preach the gospel to them anyway? Now, I do think there are some things, culturally speaking, that when you go to the Philippines, for instance, do they dress the same way we do? No, they don't. Do I have to go over there and preach to them and say, now you need to be saved, and here's a suit of clothes, you wear it just like we do in America? Is that what we're trying to accomplish? Not at all. All right? There are going to be some cultural differences, and some of those cultural differences that have nothing to do with morality. We wouldn't seek to go change those. But what we do know is this: every culture, no matter who they are, no matter what nation they live in, no matter how steep they are in false religion, they need to hear the gospel. All right? They're just a group of people for whom Christ died, and they need to hear the gospel. And so we have an early general history here of these nations forming. And then in chapter 11, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, what do we know about this story? We know that it happened before or after the general summation, most of the general summation in chapter 10. All right? Chapter 10 gives a summary. It tells us how these nations were formed. All right? In chapter number 11, and I'll put that up here, we have really what is the catalyst. What one event made it possible for these nations to be formed? What one event was it? All right? We see here by chapter 11 that the forming of the nations, it was not the idea nor the desire of mankind. Man did everything he could in order to try to not allow himself to be scattered out into nations. All right? Man didn't want anything to do with that plan. God had told him, as he reiterated to Moses, he told it to Adam, he reiterated to Moses that he wanted him to go and replenish the earth. All right? And man's command was really to spread out in the earth and to go and so God's plan was that nations would be formed all around the world. Right? That's the plan of God, but man didn't want that plan. All right? And by the way, this also helps to explain why it is that mankind really there's been a movement that you can even read about in history. There's been a movement to do away with nations for a long, really since this time. There's always been an idea that if we could get rid of nations, and just become all one people, then we would get rid of a lot of problems. We'd get rid of a lot of war. There wouldn't be any war anymore. Everybody would be like the collective. Think about socialism and communism at the highest level, with the most resources. Poor people in Indonesia, supported by and, shall we say, evened out by the rich Americans. We wouldn't have the poverty and the disparity of peoples if we didn't have nations. And so a lot of people look at a one world type of a situation without real national boundaries and things. They look at that as if it were kind of a utopia. Right? But we find out here in chapter 11 just why that is not true. All right? God knew that mankind needed to be separated into nations. And why was that? It was because of man's rebellion against God. All right? Anytime the world comes together, anytime you see the world coming together, you will find that world is not coming together to glorify God. The world always comes together to glorify man and to say that man is the greatest, that man's accomplishments are where it's at, that this world is all there is, there ain't no more, so we better enjoy while we can and give everybody the same benefits in life and all this kind of stuff. And so whenever man comes together, it's never for the purpose of glorifying God. Now let's read chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, because this gives us the story of man's rebellion against God and his separation into languages, which of course was the catalyst that separated man, that really forced man to be separated into nations, as is summarized in chapter 10. It says, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar." All right, this was big time. All right, we like to look at our technical advances today. And one of those would be this computer up here. An amazing instrument that if George Washington or Abraham Lincoln were to see this, they would be flabbergasted. We're up here watching this screen, and it's almost as if no big deal. We see that every day, right? No big deal. But if somebody even from 50 years ago were to, someone who passed away 50 years ago were to come back and see this, they would be in awe. Well, these guys had developed a technology called slime and mortar. And now they can actually build a building that's bigger than a wood structure or a lean-to kind of a building. And boy, they're excited about it. And they immediately take to build this building. But they're not doing it for the right reason. They're not doing it for God. All right? And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. All right? Who was it that had already instructed them and commanded them to be scattered abroad among the face of the whole earth? It was God. What was their biggest fear? Their biggest fear was being scattered all over the whole earth. All right? He said, we got to do whatever we can not to be scattered over the whole earth, because we have to make us a name, and there's no way we can make us a name if we're scattered all over the place. All right? What was their goal? Was their goal to glorify God? No, their goal was to make themselves a name. All right? And that's always the world's goal. Humanity's goal without God. They want to make themselves a name. They want to make themselves important. And they want to neglect and forget about God. In verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. All right, in other words, they are going to, if they're just allowed to be unchecked and have this one world thing, their whole culture will be a culture that will succeed in existing, having put God completely out of their minds, completely away. And God will not allow that to happen. All right? God created us for himself. He did not create us so that we could make ourselves a name. He created us for himself. And so God is going to intervene in this situation. And verse number 7, go to, let us go down, God says. Now this is interesting because look what man says in verse number 3. He says, go to, let us do this. And verse 4, go to, here we go. We're going to build us a city. And God says, in response, he says, go to. Let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. All right? Interesting that he says us. He doesn't say me. We know why that is, don't we? Why does he say us instead of me? Trinity, right? The Trinity. God is three persons in one. All right? So when we have references like this, I'm sure if you're reading this in the Old Testament time, there could have definitely been some wondering what does that mean exactly. And of course, we know now that the Lord is a tripartite being, and so very just even in the pronouns that are used, accuracy from the Scriptures. But he says, go to, let us go down. And we're going to confound their language that they won't understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. All right, so we understand now how exactly chapter 10 came to be, as many of these got together and said, we don't want to be separated like God wants us to be, and so God had to there confound their language. Not everybody speaks the same language. And by the way, do people speak the same language today? Not at all. It's amazing how many different languages there are. And all of that was because of God's design. God did not want man having the ability to come together as one. And so a one-world operation always will be something that stands against what God wants. And I think as well, when you think about the perversion of the idea of there's been a perversion even in our country of the idea of diversity. And it's kind of like, well, let's let the United States let the United States be an example of how all the people can come together so that now we can then translate that into a worldwide kind of phenomenon where we can get rid of the idea of nations. We can get rid of that idea and have a one world government, and it'll be so much better because man will be the one who has brought this into being. And instead, of course, we know what would happen, and we know what will happen. What will happen? And we'll look at that later, but as we generally summarize even here, from the very start, God says, I know what's going to happen if these people are allowed to continue without being diversified, without being spread about. Well, I know what's going to happen. Nothing that they imagine to do will be restrained from them, and it'll happen when one world government is there. Who will they follow? Will they follow Jesus? Who is their leader? The Antichrist, right? Are they there to glorify God? No, they're the one world government that it will be an enemy of God, and that will always be the way that it is. Now, as we next time we'll start from here. We have very early on after this as well. In fact, right in the next chapter, we have. In fact, even in this chapter, we start with the genealogy of Abram, and then in chapter 12 we see Abram called out of the land of Ur, and God is going to make him a promise, and that promise also has to do with the nations. The nations are very much included in the promise that God gave to Abraham. And so we'll look at that next time. As it won't be next week. It'll be a couple of weeks from now, Lord willing. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.